Does the survival horror genre need new life breathing into it? Has it ever? The fifth console generation, the era when the survival horror genre of video games was formally codified, though there had certainly been games of this design before Resident Evil, exploded the genre to the peak of popularity. It was hardly the first game of its type, but it codified the core tenets of the genre, following concepts from horror movies to provide as disturbing of an atmosphere as possible. On the first Sony PlayStation console in particular, new influential series sprung up through the latter half of the 1990s, such as Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and many, many more. This was considered by some to be the golden age of the genre that would last until about halfway through the next console generation. And again, it was Resident Evil that seemed to define the subtle shift away from pure horror towards a slightly more action-driven bent. But if Climax Graphics had gotten their way, there would have been a bit more of a shift in the genre long before this. They were a small company, ultimately only to produce 3 games to their name before shutting down in 2003. Climax Graphics was an offshoot of the larger company Climax Entertainment, responsible for several well-known role-playing games from the early 1990s. But scriptwriter and producer Shinya Nishigaki, who was tired of working on role-playing games, wanted to do something different. His new subsidiary company would focus on more cinematic experiences, and their first project was a survival horror game, Blue Stinger. Published in Japan by Sega and Activision in the West, this title abandoned almost all of the atmospheric ideas established by Resident Evil. It was bright and exciting, full of, in concept, witty banter, intentional as opposed to the accidentally awful dialogue in Resident Evil, and it re-emphasised the combat with shooter and beat-em-up elements that the aforementioned other series had all, in one way or another, shied away from. The survival aspect came from careful item management, as ammo and supplies are limited, and the concern that it takes time to heal, leaving the player vulnerable in the moment. And the horror comes from the grotesque creature show of the game's enemies library. Can you merge horror and comedy? Well, yes actually, definitely. Movies like Shaun of the Dead and 1,000 others prove that this can work. Comedy horror novels appeared on the scene almost at the dawn of the genre, with light-hearted pastiches of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein following in its wake. Video games, however, have had a much more spotty ride of things. Blue Stinger was not the pioneer it set out to be, and although it sold 500,000 copies, it was far from being one of the Dreamcast's most celebrated launch games. In fact, so keen were Activision to make the game have impact, they sent it to shops a full week ahead of the Dreamcast launch, so that their excited fans could purchase it and sit on the game disc ahead of the hardware's arrival. In the internet age of pre-downloading titles ahead of their official launch is one thing, but the whole point of discs is that you just slot them into place. What exactly was wrong with Blue Stinger? Well, unfortunately it depends which version you're playing. There are some very common problems, of course, mainly the abysmal script, which falls apart in almost every aspect. The main characters are Elliot Ballard, a fairly clueless rescue worker, and Dogs Bauer, a Sully sea captain determined to smash through every one of the stereotypes that entails. The two men, aided from a central location by Janine, an island security guard stuck manning the console after injuring her leg at the start of the game, and the fourth character is a strange blue spirit that floats around, following Elliot from place to place, adapting the form of a naked blue woman because she's imitating a model toy that Elliot had aboard his ship when he encountered her. It's vague, pointless and shallow, but a core example of the kind of humour that Blue Stinger thrives in. Elliot and Dogs are supposed to represent some kind of buddy action comedy heroes, but they have no material to work with, save for one lusting after Janine while the other bitches about her, or taking shallow digs at each other. Neither reacts remotely surprised to find themselves stranded on an island surrounded by walking monstrosities. Instead, both of them take the situation in their stride until things take a turn to the dark 2/3 of the way through the game. It's not all bad though. Ryan Drummond and Dean Bristow, who also lent their voices to the main characters of another Dreamcast launch game of some note, are clearly having a good time just messing around with these characters. For most of the bit part actors, the voice acting here is truly awful, but there is a perverse pleasure in hearing these two men argue about whether it's appropriate to take a bath in the middle of a monster invasion. So the real problem with Blue Stinger is deciding which version to play. Developed by a Japanese team, the original version of the game was a little closer to the Resident Evil formula than its Western counterpart. Each room had a selection of fixed camera points that gave the game a distinct and atmospheric feel. However, the complex and condensed level designs meant that it was often hard to tell if monsters were lurking around a corner or out of sight. The fixed cameras had to move in some truly awkward way to follow the character. Perhaps, if more attention had been paid to the sound design or the game pacing, this wouldn't have been a problem, but it does make the game incredibly difficult to complete. Activision, when they showed the game to the Western press, got a fairly negative response that unnerved them enough to go and reprogram the game's camera. In the Western releases, they programmed a rudimentary system where the camera follows Elliot and Dogs around from behind, like in the Tomb Raider games. This makes it much more easy to keep track of where the monsters are, but it absolutely ruins any atmosphere of the game. It feels cheap and clunky and awkward to control. To add insult to injury, the game leans into the backtracking, the lock and key mechanism of other survival games. You are constantly tasked with wandering back and forth through confusing environments, with enemies that respawn whenever you enter or leave a room. Downing a mutant will cause it to explode in a shower of coins that you can use to purchase new ammunition, healing items, or even miss weapons at vending machines scattered around the world. In a way, it's refreshing to see a game that clearly knows it's a video game and lean into the surrealism, but the results are mixed, to say the least. Behind the messy production, the game actually does quite a few interesting things. Setting a disaster movie plot around Christmas Day itself is a nice idea. The callback to the Die Hard movies, just one of many movie references littered throughout the script, and it does give the game a unique flavour. That, combined with the bizarre transformation that Elliot goes through 3/4 of the way through the game, which temporarily unlocks a new ability, briefly spices up the gameplay. At several points, you are set challenges to complete within a set time limit, and failure there can result in either death or increased tedium in the next challenging area of the game. If the game camera and controls weren't fighting the player and the level design wasn't deliberately confusing, then some of these concepts, many of them borrowed straight from the Resident Evil series but amped up to the next degree, would be more than welcome. A small bit of polish to create a camera system halfway between the two extremes between the Western and Japanese release, and a second draft of the script could have turned this game into something special. For people who can get into its weird vibe, there's something brilliantly bizarre about these chimera creatures stalking around a Christmas-themed supermarket. Although it released in the millennium, it was set in 2018, so it's fun to see an imagined future that almost could have been, but never was. Survival horror didn't change. It stayed dark and gritty and grim, and we're living with the consequences of that still.